and have it out there.
I'll go next. Hi, everybody. My name is Ashish. I work at Nordstrom in the platform engineering team, where we run a multi-tenant platform for whole of Nordstrom engineering using Kubernetes, using AWS as our cloud provider. We use Terraform driven by Make to provision clusters, to provision our multi-cluster platform. I am here to participate by myself, kind of to interact with the community and see where I can contribute. So I've been working on Kubernetes for about a year and a half now. Worked with a couple of projects in the community, worked with a few folks from Heptio on Arc. I've worked on Terraform providers, like the Google providers for Terraform. Yeah, that's my background.
Okay, I'll go. What's up, everybody? I'm Chris Nova. I'm one of the founding members of the ClusterAPI project. I work at Heptio. I wrote a book on this stuff. I'm just here to kind of be a fly on the wall and observe and make sure folks have what they need to be productive. So nice to meet everyone, or see you again if we've already been on the phone today together.
Cool. So I guess I can go next. So my name is Alberto. I work for Red Hat. Some folks at Red Hat, as Cesar mentioned before, they built a kind of very OpenShift-specific AWS actuator. We are working now on making this more generic and leverage the Cluster API in a more generic way. So I'm very keen on see how we can unify efforts. That's me.
I have one more thing I needed to add to that's relevant for folks to know. I'm also one of the organizers of SIG AWS, so I'll also be playing a little bit of a liaison role between that SIG and this effort, which I think is officially sponsored under SIG Cluster Lifecycle. But in general, I'm kind of here to just like grease the wheel and make sure everybody stays happy. But there's that snippet as well.
My name is Liz. I'm an engineer at Heptio as well. I work mostly on the KubeADM project and Sonoboy, so I'm also just here to help out in any way I can. Mostly I'm going to be sitting back and listening.
Hi, I'm Amit. I work at Pivotal. We offer a product for enterprises to offer on-demand Kubernetes clusters to their dev teams on any cloud. And it's all driven under the hood by Bosch, which some people may be familiar with. So I'm just interested in following along with the developments in the Kubernetes community and the Cluster API.
Hey, I'm Devin Goodwin. I'm also at Red Hat working on the cluster operator project with Cesar and others, and had done some work on what we had so far for an AWS actuator. Yeah, that's it for me.
Hey guys, this is Josh. I work with Volk and helped out on the cross-cloud project, and just interested in the Cluster API project and seeing where it can go. Playing around with working on a provider and just trying to soak in everything that I can hear. So I'm just here to help out if I can as well.
Hi, my name is Erin Metzel. I'm a product manager at Heptio working with Tim and Chris and the rest of the team. We're just really focused on making Kubernetes easier to deploy and operate for our customers. So I'll just be doing a lot of listening and learning and maybe some chiming in.
Anybody else? I'll pause for a second. So there's a bunch of folks kind of all doing similar-ish type of things in the community. I think the purpose of the kickoff meeting was to kind of rally those efforts towards a common set of solutions that we can agree upon. Because it makes no sense for everyone to maintain their own independent thing when we'd be solving a common set of problems. Yay, open source, that's what it's really good for. Typically in the past, we usually find the best way to go about doing some of this stuff is to rally on a spec. But right now, that might be a little premature. I'm sure there are things we could do almost immediately to kind of make a little bit of progress and then make the spec kind of evolve as we get enough people to take a look at it. So are folks aware that there already exists an AWS repo? There is one. It's very sparse at this point. I think it has one issue and one pull request. So let me put that in the notes here. Does somebody want to take notes, by the way, while I'm talking? That would be super helpful.
I can take notes, and then I also just have a quick question. In the notes section, are we basically doing an open agenda like we do on the SIG calls as well?
Yes.
Okay. I'll take notes and format that. Thanks.
Okay. So there exists a repo, just so like a PSA right now, there exists a repo there. It's in the notes right now. It's also pasted in the chat window, which I did, for folks to kind of rally on. What I think makes a lot of sense right now is almost every single provider has some common themes for the very beginning of what they create. And we can probably stub out a good portion of that and then rally on a spec. And I do believe the one pull request that is there provides some level of specification. So I think a common way for folks to kind of move forwards is to work on a doc. There exists a doc that we started on our side. Jason worked on it, but he's kind of currently sick. Kind of starting to lay down some of the details there. And it's totally open for folks to, let me see if I can share his document. No, I'll have to copy it. Maybe I can copy the document to the end of this current one. Give me 1 second here, and then anybody can comment or look at it. I don't expect to have the conversation today on the details, but just to rally on the notion of rallying on specs, right? And usually that's a good conversation piece for us to start to go through in depth some of the details that we can agree upon, disagree upon, and find some common core behavior that we think we should drive towards. So now we kind of have an overview of what some people are interested in. We kind of have some deets down below in the document. One of the things I was kind of looking and hoping for from this larger group as we kind of start to talk about this is to list down some requirements that people have. Like Ilya explicitly specified one is that for any provider, it'd be nice to be able to have both a customized version as well as an EKS version. Chris, did we ever settle on a name for that? We have there was a separate issue we filed with regards to how do you name?
I think we still need a name for that. I've been using the word flavors, but that's a horrible name. But maybe that's something we can follow up on for next week's call.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it perhaps is the kind of thing where the control plane isn't directly managed by the provider. Something else manages the provider. we just call that management thingy.
So I imagine the EKS provider being different from the AWS provider, and both of those names are not confusable. So I figured we would have two repos, one for EKS, one for AWS.
So
I don't know if there's a lot of overlap.
we talked about that a little bit in the Cluster API working group, and I think folks were mostly leaning towards keeping all of the AWS style work in the same repo, and then this word that Tim was just talking about, having, I think we were just using the word providers here, but having different styles or flavors of implementation in each repo was, I think, the direction we wanted to go as a SIG, but open for discussion here. I mean, we should do what makes sense for us and for this project.
So that's a good meta topic to start to have the discussion on, you know, and then we can start to refine requirements from there. Because this, I do think if you were to have multiple implementations of EKS, it would kind of, what I'm trying to avoid is fragmentation, and too much fragmentation for a given cloud provider, right? And for a lot of the parameters that you'd specify for a given provider, some of which would be common for EKS across both EKS and, you know, a custom AWS implementation, and some would be orthogonal too, right? But it's not, it's definitely a subset, right? So some of the details and the information you would pass through from provider config through for EKS versus like your own custom one could be the same sets of data. So that bit seems to make a lot of sense to have commonality there.
So do you have an example of what such, an example of something that would be similar between AWS as the provider and EKS as the provider?
My favorite example to use here is public and private topologies in Amazon. I think it's easy for folks to grok, and it gives an example of how we would have two Kubernetes clusters effectively behaving the same, but in very different networking environments. One networking environment that's publicly accessible, and the other one that's non-publicly accessible. And writing two different implementations for those two different styles of Kubernetes, as Tim was saying, does have a lot of commonality. But when you get right down to where the rubber meets the road, we're actually making different API calls to Amazon and actually setting up different network interfaces. And in some cases, creating things that we didn't create in the other example. So those are kind of where the boundaries are logically here of how we might start looking at having multiple, again, we don't have a good word here, but multiple styles of Kubernetes clusters in the same Amazon repo.
I like flavors. I think that's a good terminology. I'm going to stick with it.
Okay. I mean, we can work on that. It's a clockwork.
Yeah. But I think I will agree with David that EKS and AWS, from my perspective right now, don't kind of belong together. Maybe it's just a matter of time and needing to getting used to it. But that's my pulse right now.
It's entirely. Are folks aware of how sort of the internal controller manager inside of Kubernetes operates?
I think so.
Kind of, sort of.
So it's totally possible. I think one thing we want to make sure too is that inside of the controller manager for Kubernetes, there are many controllers, and they're based upon independent resources. And there's nothing that prevents us from having sort of this Venn diagram of resources and having multiple controllers that we kind of co-maintain within this repository. So that model exists in upstream, where you have different flavors and you use a different sort of incantation that you pass to things on startup, but the backend code has, you know, a different set of control loops or rectification for those independent resources or objects that may have overlap.
Doesn't Cluster Cuddle use the controller manager code already? I remember seeing an example where we launched two different controllers running in the same process.
I'm not entirely certain there.
I don't know if it's the machine set controller and the machine controller, but But yes, Tim, to answer to your point, yes, I agree that we can have multiple controllers monitoring the same resource, maybe filtering on some tag that. So one example that kind of pops up to mind is some sort of a controller for secrets, which says there's a controller that is just sanity checking the secrets or making sure the secrets are strong enough, and the other is responsible for propagating secrets to different namespaces. Only if you have a tag, say propagate true, will the propagate controller propagate the secret, but there is this other controller which is monitoring all secrets, right? So that was one example that kind of came to mind as you were speaking. So are you saying that based on the providers, one controller logic will reconcile that, and the other controller will just kind of do perform a no op?
Yes, or it could be either a sub resource of provider config,
Okay.
or of a different provider config, or it could be the actual, switching on contents of a given resource. So it's up to us, or we could even fragment and somehow figure out a way to like have a hierarchy of resources. But there's nothing that prevents us from splitting out the configuration, but still having a sort of generic umbrella that kind of ties it all together on startup, right? Think for lack of a better, this is a terrible analogy, but just bear with me. Discriminated unions inside of C are an example of, you have the single blob, which could be A or B, and you could pass it all through, and based upon if it's A or B, it's evaluated differently.
Mm-hmm.
So one trade-off I see, we've talked in the past about what would happen if there were two legitimate, two providers for the same cloud that we wanted to support, and how we might share a repo for them. I don't think we've thought through the details of that. So a positive for sharing the GKE and AWS repos would be to force us to start thinking about how multiple controllers could share the same repo now. And then the negative is that we'd have to start thinking about it now instead of later.
Yeah, we could always choose to do A and then stub for B, as a group. It depends upon who's going to put in the work, right? Ultimately, open source is all about, people stepping up to the plate and saying like, I would love to help working on this. And then the collective kind of trying to help shepherd it in a manner that is amenable to all parties involved, right? Go ahead, Chris. You unmuted.
Oh, no, I was going to make a comment, but you already said it.
So I think if folks want to, it's kind of like any other SIG, right? A lot of people are there. Some people want some things and some people want other things. And I think the key there is just rallying on a spec that we can, that we agree to, right? So my kind of goal here in this first part of this first kind of kickoff meeting is to kind of gather really big requirements, right? And that sort of flipping of EKS, being able to support those two different flavors, which I like. I don't know. We should name the flavors. That'd be more fun. And then the ability to support those two different flavors is like a good example of a requirement, right? And I think, do folks have other examples of like larger requirements that they can think of?
Compliance needs, maybe. If you have to run in certain AWS environments, like if you've got like HIPAA requirements or something, I think certain clouds have. There's like GovCloud and stuff.
Does anyone know if EKS, if there's some segmentation between like standard GovCloud stuff and EKS, or if it's supported or anything like that? I've got no clue.
It's probably not supported, but
two regions at the moment, as far as I know, and I doubt that the special gov region is a place where they with it as well. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, but
It's not there. It's only in US and only into regions, but not in the government one, for example.
So we're trying to identify if there is any other flavor we can think of that will help the discussion. Like, I mean, I wonder if there could be some, like, some certain other flavors where people actually run control plane as pods in a management cluster, and nodes are run separately, or versus control plane running a completely external place, like on different set of instances, right? I think maybe that's another kind of flavor we can think about.
Yeah, this is our main use case. Actually, we want to run mainly nodes. I mean, we want to run mainly the machines as nodes. Yeah, we provision. We are currently provisioning the control plane inside of another Kubernetes cluster. So,
right.
Yeah,
and I think some certain other flavors could be ones where. I just lost it. I had something in mind. Well, it'll come back to me. I'll let you know.
Do we talk about degrees of reliability, like number of masters, number of etcds, like?
Do you spread across zones? Do you not spread across zones, etc.?
Yeah. Do you have certain? You can specify that two machines won't run in like the same rack or something in AWS, I think.
Oh, are you talking about like anti-affinity?
Yeah.
I think there's a notion of shared and dedicated tenancy. Like you can get sort of shared tenancy hypervisor or dedicated tenancy.
Yeah.
Oh, so yeah, that could be a thing, but I don't think it's like a flavor, right? That's more like a parameter. But the kind of very specific flavor type thing that I actually had in mind was one where you would manage nodes yourself somehow versus let an autoscaling group own nodes, right? So I think that could be a separate kind of flavor. Arguably.
That would kind of be an implementation detail of the autoscaler, don't you think?
Potentially, maybe, yeah. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it could be an option of some sort, right? So yeah.
Yeah, the current autoscaler, at least for AWS, watches ASGs and scales up and down the ASGs as it seems fit. It goes by annotations or tags on the ASGs as to which ASGs it has to monitor.
Okay, well, that's that's no autoscaler part. I think that's a separate part. But the actual it's not exactly that level, right? It's like, how do we create the nodes? Do we for each node that we want to create, do we call the ASG API, or do we call the other one? And the other one would involve us doing a lot more work there, right?
Yes.
So it could be a completely different type of implementation. That's why I think maybe it's a flavor, maybe it's not so much a flavor.
So are you saying the flavor being the machine controller, does it talk to the EC2 API or the ASG API?
Yeah, I thought that's what I had in mind. Yeah.
Okay.
But I don't know if it's a flavor versus a parameter, right? But I mean, also, yeah. Does the well, with EKS versus something, EKS versus a fully managed, fully user-owned cluster, let's say, call it that. There's probably significant difference there. Although we could argue that node management could be abstracted away in a very similar fashion, right? Although EKS imposes certain requirements around what subnets you have and what those really mean. while if you're not using that, you could do whatever you like. You could just have a single subnet for the whole cluster.
I want to give Chris a chance to chat too, because she's got a bunch of notes there that she's written down. So, and a lot of experience in the space too. So.
Yeah, totally. So I think with Ilya's comment on, is an ASG or an EC2, is that logical boundary at the flavor level or at the parameter level? I definitely think it's at the flavor level. The nitty gritty of getting into actually creating the user data and deploying a machine is pretty complex. When you go from the launch configuration ASG approach versus the EC2 approach. And there's just a lot of subtleties there and how those resources relate together. You're going to need to get data from other bits of the deployment as well, so you know which subnet to create it in, and it gets pretty complicated. So I think separating those on the flavor level makes sense. That's my opinion for what it's worth. And then moving forward, I have added a couple of comments here, and I have a couple of more concerns as well, and I'm thinking it might even be useful for me and maybe Justin Santa Barbara to sit down and just kind of do like a brain dump of like all the stuff that we learned the hard way in COPS and Keep a Corn, just so that we kind of have like at least some sort of record of these lessons that we learned and these little one-offs that we had to hack our way through. But the big ones for me was storage and termination protection on destroy, or more importantly, what is our destroy policy? Which says if we do, for whatever reason, maybe somebody changes the replica count, or maybe a node goes bad, or for some reason we destroy a node, what happens to the underlying resources, particularly the EBS volumes that were attached to it, and do we want to terminate the instance, or do we just want to stop the instance? And maybe there is some parameterization around destroy and create as well that we need to configure. So as we start looking at this, I think it's going to make sense to figure out what these flavors are, and maybe we have one that's like focused on Liz's point on compliance, and we have another one that's sort of like the simple implementation that's just good old EC2, and then we have like one that's a little more like resilient that spans multiple availability zones or something.
I think what might make sense from this point, like once we start to capture more and more requirements, is eventually pick like a single MVP, right, that we can rally on.
Yeah.
And then expand on that MVP over time to encompass other use cases and scenarios. Because one thing that's pretty common in these types of problems is that you can get analysis paralysis. And there's a big group of people here, and we don't want that to happen. We'd much rather have a focused, deliverable effort. And we can agree to disagree on some different parameters or flavor configuration that we want to. But I think if we write them down in the different incantations that we could potentially support, at least do the due diligence in the beginning, and then make a first pass cut, which I'm guaranteed will probably suck. In hindsight, it'll probably be like one of those things where like we shouldn't have done this, because that's the way it always works. But at least it gives us a target to aim at, and then as we iterate, we can start to refine that process and make it better.
Yeah. What do we think about for that MVP as we go through the process of defining what our first flavor is going to look like? Would it be meaningful to sort of templatize that and say, for a flavor, we need to define these, n number of factors, and provide owners to these flavors that can sort of like shepherd them through and prevent us from getting that analysis paralysis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to write stuff down and get some history lessons too. I'm a big fan of, I'm a huge history buff fan. And I've always found that Kubernetes lacks the dissemination of history. So having some set of historical record that we at least scroll down somewhere that basically says, here are the known knowns based upon trial and error and experience that we've had. And here is what we see today. And this is the path that we're going to try to go down. Seems like a logical approach. And then after that, we can iterate. But I know different parties are going to have different vested interests.
Yeah.
So hi, I'm Rafael. So I joined the call and I totally failed to introduce because I couldn't talk. But anyway, I totally second the idea of actually collecting some, so to say, historical data of other tools that have been around there. I mean, we can ask maybe with a mail to CGWS or directly to CGWS, which I think the meeting is this Friday. I don't know which time. I think it would be a good idea. There are a lot of learnings, and thinking about that, I think, for example, of like different ways of upgrading nodes. For example, like making upgrades that are, for example, aware of stateful workloads that don't tolerate too much, being rescheduled like every time you kill a node, stuff like that. That of course we don't have to focus on right now. But I think it would be nice to focus on an MVP and start collecting all those thoughts together, such that we can, get the best out of it. Because I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of learnings with a lot of tools like Kops, Kops, KubeAWS, Kubicorn, Heptio Quickstarter, which also did a great job at a lot of things, and EKS Cuddle, and whatever it is.
Chris, you had some more requirements about like general parameters or flavors. I'm still, the vernacular and the lines are really fuzzy for me at this point.
Yeah, I think the way I'm thinking about it is a flavor to me would represent a single execution path that is independent from other flavors. And a parameter, I kind of imagine that like an environmental variable or like a flag you would pass in that just changes subtle behavior that is relevant across multiple flavors. That's how I'm sort of mentally drawing the boundary here. I don't know if that helps folks.
That does make a lot of sense. The way you put it across, like the execution path and also like config flags or environment variables.
Yeah, so like here would be a great example for folks to start thinking about. A flavor would be EKS versus a raw Amazon implementation, and a parameter would be -- spot pricing that says, regardless of if you're using EKS or if you're using Amazon EC2, we want to try to go the affordable route and use spot instances where we can. So anyway, some other requirements I had was I just wanted folks to start thinking about guarantees as we go through this process, guarantees around our infrastructure, particularly around things like item potency and what we do when things fail. We all know the infrastructure is going to fail. Nodes are not going to come up. Something's going to go wrong. We're going to be blindsided. And as we start to build out this software, being able to mentally say, oh, I know that this function call or this API transaction guarantees it's either going to do exactly what I want it to do, or it's going to fail and undo its work. It's going to be handy for us as engineers as we start crafting the software. So I don't know if that's probably going to be a lifetime of going through the code like one by one and making sure that these functions are actually guaranteeing what we expect them to. But just as we start going through this process, bear these things in mind, that anywhere we can offer an explicit guarantee is going to be helpful. Cool.
Another thing it's very fuzzy for me with ClusterAPI, it's not very clear to me, is the idea of lifecycle management for things like upgrades. It can be very interesting of how you want to approach it. There can be different ways you can do it. Some people want immutable infrastructure, where like you never mutate the nodes at all, ever. And some other people might want to be able to mutate the existing environment. So decisions like that we should try to make in the beginning for an MVP at least, because that'll have pretty lasting consequences, right?
Absolutely. And I think, there's sort of two proposals that we're talking about here. One of which is a broader, what generalized behavior do we want the AWS implementation to sort of like favor? And then, which particular flavor is our first one that we're going to work on. But I think the upgrade story is going to be huge. We really can't afford to get that wrong, because, in my mind, that's really one of the big wins that we're getting by lobbying together as a community and starting this effort, is we were finally going to get a good upgrade story. So with the proposals, Tim, how do you think we should go about starting to draft these or look at these?
Well, I think like step one, getting some a history lesson makes a ton of sense. So like if we can reach out, if someone like you wants to reach out to Justin and kind of draft down like these are the things we learned and these are the things we want to avoid. I think that makes a ton of sense. And then maybe another independent group can be working down like here's how we kind of see breaking down the different flavors and potential parameters across a larger group. I would almost, the way we approach it in steering is we have like little mini groups that kind of federate out and kind of come back to this larger group in the next time or the next meeting. So that way we can still make progress on these independent things over time. Does that seem like a reasonable approach?
Yeah, totally. If we could get owners with just an idea of who's doing what before our next meeting, or even on this meeting, I think that would be helpful.
So I can help solicit and get folks to rally on putting down things on paper for generalized requirements in like a kept style. If folks want to join in, just put your name next to it in the doc, and I'll try and get another doc going, and I'll talk with Jason and Chuck. I'm gonna basically be facilitating more so than actually the doing. Are there other folks that are interested in helping that?
Hi, Nadir here, probably from Scale Factory will have something. I think another thing that would be useful is if we have like a feature variability models. So rather than just think about individual flavors, what are the features that people want? And there'll be cuts of those features which are incompatible with each other that will or cuts of features which are compatible with each other that will form different flavors, and will also help us figure out what are those common elements, I think.
I agree. I think like enumerating some of the different possible incantations in sort of like specification forms, or maybe even like enumerating the different options that we can think of, is probably like the first part of a spec, right? So I think that's almost even better than trying to come to the next meeting with a spec. Would be come to a listing, come to the table with a history of lessons learned, and come to the table to the next time with a series of enumerations, because those two feed as an input, independent inputs as part of a larger spec.
Just one question. Right now, there is a PR for at least the machine part from Caesar. So, are we going to proceed with the PR and this document that is already being created right now?
Yeah, I had the same question.
So I think before we start merging some of those PRs, we should rally on what we want to do first, because I don't want to give any precedent for things until we've kind of agreed. And then once we agreed, we're just going to move fast. So I think there's some pieces that outside of the scope of the individual spec and requirements analysis, there are logistics that need to be handled. The unfun details of hooking up Tide and all the other stuff and the bots, as well as getting some basic componentry in place for evaluation. We could use help with that for sure. Getting the plumbing, the groundwork going.
Yeah, absolutely. That's not an easy task, setting up a new repo and getting us what we need. Does anybody have a link to that PR that you were just talking about, Marty?
There's only one PR in the repo.
There's only one.
Okay, I'll add it to the doc.
Yeah, so this is last work group meeting. I had to take the doc that we had running and turn it into a PR, and that's what that is.
Yeah.
I think I can help out in like contributing as to what has worked for us so far, spinning up unmanaged clusters in AWS, and how we do it, and what we like about it, what we don't like about it. I can speak to that, or contribute to that in however we want to discuss that.
I think we could even do like a whole section on lessons learned. Like if we just came armed to the next meeting on like, here are the incantations that we had, here are the good aspects, here are the bad aspects, and then kind of distill those down from different people or different providers. I think that alone is a very fruitful effort, and would feed into the next steps. I think in the enumeration of some of the different flavors and parameters can occur independently. But I think by next meeting, if we were to start to talk about some of that stuff, I think that would be great.
That same sentiment for requirements as well. I think they kind of go hand in hand. What is important to me in my engineering org, and what have we learned along our journey to get here?
Yeah, and I also wonder, I guess there are kind of like very bold questions that one could ask. Why this isn't a a feature in COPS that we are working on? Why are we working on a new project? Why is it not a feature in Cubicorn or some other project, right? Why is it like a whole separate project? And yeah, I guess that's sort of related to that, isn't it?
Yes and no, kind of, can be.
I mean, I think a lot of my lessons learned in COPS, that basically was the inspiration for Cubicorn. And then, I learned a whole other second round of lessons as well with Cubicorn. So I'll definitely have a pretty long list of things for this next meeting, but I think we should get some on.
I'm super excited to sit down and like make s'mores around the campfire and listen to listen to the tales and horrors that have occurred over time.
So if you agree, I can add to the action item to actually send an email to ClusterAPI AWS, to the mailing group, to invite people to actually collect those feedback. Or if you don't agree, we should at least clarify when, this we have to do it anyways, right? So when the next meeting will actually be, because I think this is actually kind of ad hoc, right? I'm not sure what's the cadence.
It is. I guess that's probably another topic. It'd be like, what time, because it seems like there's a lot of interested parties here, 28 people, that's pretty big. What should we send out a doodle and try to coordinate a time that works for folks to figure out, should we have regular reoccurring meetings and figure out a frequency and time?
Yeah. Yes, I would suggest once a week to get started, especially with the amount of people here. And then also on that email, I was thinking an email to SIG Cluster Lifecycle, an email to SIG AWS, put the same doodle in both, and then it might even make sense to just start a whole new doc where we can start to highlight lessons learned and requirements, so folks can start pre-fleshing that out before this next meeting, because I have a feeling once we get SIG AWS involved as well, 28 people is going to be a low number for us.
Okay. So it sounds to me like, who wants to take point on the administrivia with doodles and docs?
I can do doodles and docs.
All right. I appreciate it, Chris.
Sure.
And do folks who are interested in sort of capturing history want to coordinate with Chris? And folks who want to capture or just enumerate potential options, I can help facilitate, but I'm probably not going to be on point. I'm going to probably throw Jason under the bus and maybe put him on point for some of this stuff. He's not here, so I can do it.
I can help out on that.
Okay.
Okay, so Tim, you're going to be collecting the history and the lessons learned, and I'm going to be focusing on requirements.
Dyslexiate that. I'm gonna enumerate the state space, or at least rally the folks to enumerate the state space, be a facilitator, and then if you can help facilitate the the history and, oh my gosh, we should never do this again, or we should do these things.
Okay. And what do you mean by state space?
Listing of options of different ways people could at least start to enumerate the ways that we could construct flavors, or sort of even help to sort of like lay down taxonomy if that's possible.
Okay, I see. So you're just going to take a stab at sort of bringing a shape to what we've just been talking about technically.
Yeah, and then start to get more details inside of what that looks like.
And that will probably drive us to pick up what our MVP will be.
Exactly. So I think what we'll do is we'll have two separate inputs that will feed out into like maybe a single spec.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay.
Are there
So
other
do we have
things?
I'm sorry. Do we have a separate Google group for this that we need to be on, or where will the discussions happen?
That's all going to be an artifact of the doodles and docs work that I'll be sending out to the SIGs.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure that I'm subscribed and I don't miss email.
Yeah, as long as you're in either SIG Cluster Lifecycle or SIG AWS, you should get the email.
Okay. Checking if I'm in either.
Are there other things? Because I can't think of, I mean, there's a bunch of other requirements we can start to enumerate and list down. Are there other things that folks wanted to discuss today? I think we have like 7 minutes left.
The big one for me, and then this might be a requirement, this might be an implementation detail, but at some point it might make sense for us to start considering how we're going to manage things like authorization and IAM profiling, and how we're going to handle the security element to this whole thing. I feel like that's whenever we're starting new projects, especially in Kubernetes, it's sometimes easy to overlook security out of the gates, but if we could get that in out of the gate, that would be rad. And again, I feel like a lot of the security concerns that the history work I'm doing and the state space stuff that you're doing, Tim, but still wanted to call it out.
So when you say security, are you seeing security in the internal clusters or the external clusters?
I think cross the stack security, everything from how do we authenticate to the Kubernetes API, all the way up to which IAM user are we using, all the way to are we storing AWS API credentials and secrets or not, or where are those going? So anywhere across the whole process, just wanted to have a security-minded posture as we start bringing shape to things.
So there is this other project that we run, like called Kube2IAM, which allows pods to have identities. They run as daemon sets in the cluster itself. I'm not sure how that would, or if that would tie into the work that we are doing.
There's been some discussion happening in SIG AWS around what we're going to do canonically for IAM identity for pods. There's two proposals. One's from USwitch, which has taken the history of the previous implementations, including Kube2IAM, and AWS has a longer-term proposal, which requires SDK changes. Nothing's been decided yet, as far as I know.
Okay. I know Azure has like a pod identity implementation. I've just looked at it. I've not spent too much time on it. But I'm just aware that there is something like that. I don't know if you want to implement something similar here, or if that effort is like out of scope of what we are trying to do.
Netflix did something interesting with NIC per pod, so that IaaS level security groups could be applied to pods, which I think is a pretty interesting thing. I know it's a challenge to have to deal with the overlay network security policies and the underlay, and what manages poking all the right holes at the right times dynamically through both layers. So I think that was kind of an interesting thing, maybe something to think about here as well.
Well, it's interesting that we get to discuss these things already in the first meeting, but I was kind of wondering that what is really maybe when we need to more specifically define what are we going to address and what we are not going to address. And I thought my understanding so far was this was mostly about defining the API and an implementation that proves that the API works, and then we could move on and see how that API extends beyond such a basic implementation. And I thought for 13 parts of it, EKS makes a very good fit because there's many things that you don't need to worry about in EKS. And we could just, iron out the whatever the objects we're going to use to represent nodes, for example, right? And a super simple representation of a control plane object. Just a thought. That's kind of like that's the angle I'm mostly coming from with the EKS. That we could advance the effort of the working group and the SIG by starting off with something where we can rely on certain things, not having to worry about certain things, such as running the control plane, and then we can proceed towards other more complex use cases.
I think we need to represent these options at least in some sort of model, and whether that cut might be yes, just EKS, and these are things we're not going to take care of right now. That might be fine, but we should represent. I think we should have some representation of the maximal set of requirements and concerns.
Yeah, I totally agree with that approach, because that's kind of what I'm trying to do in rallying around the history plus enumerating the state space of requirements, not necessarily picking a path, because different parties in this group, as well as different parties outside in the broader community, will want different things and be able to commit to certain things.
Did anybody else just have a glitch in their
yeah, I didn't hear much.
I did too. What I was saying is I agree with what I missed the name, sorry.
Nadir.
Nadir. What Nadir said is that because there is a large group of folks here with working for different companies, they will have different interests, right? And they may not. I don't want to be prescriptive. I never, as a SIG lead, I should never be prescriptive, because we should rally around who is able to execute on what. And so long as we have a framework by which we can all agree upon for execution, and that way the MVPs will kind of be self-evident, right? By who's going to step up to the plate to execute on these pieces.
Totally.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have a minute left.
Yeah, I think we're at a minute. So I think the action items, just to reiterate, we have Chris is going to work on doodles and docs, which we should totally make some type of pun out of. I'll try to enumerate some taxonomy and how to sort of frame and talk about this stuff and get all the pieces in place. And I'm not going to actually do probably all of the work. I'm going to help to facilitate it. So if people want to come along and help, that would be helpful too. And then Chris said she was going to reach out to gather the history and the lessons learned from Justin, etc. Are there other things that folks? I think we're going to hold on the current PR for the time being, if that's okay with Caesar.
Can we add a note to the paper trails there?
Yes.
That's fine. So the result of these two efforts that we're kicking off today, are they going to be in documents that are linked from this document?
I think we'll probably, the doodles and docs portion will like have the history of where we should start to get some of this stuff. I think we should do our due diligence and put a reference back to this doc for sure.
Yeah. The way I was thinking about my doodles and docs sort of email was to give a summary of what we went over today, link it back to this email, offer new docs that are shared with the corresponding SIGs as needed, and offer a doodle with a proposal of a weekly meeting for people to fill out so we can try to get something on the calendar. Does that sparkle with everyone? Cool.
All right. Well, I appreciate everyone coming. Thanks, Chris, for taking notes and helping me talk about this and not seem totally incompetent. And I appreciate everyone and their feedback and their input.
Peace.
All right. See ya.
Thanks.
Again.